He thought she was just another roadside mechanic he could ignore. But by this time tomorrow, a helicopter would be hovering over her home, and the entire street would fall silent. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The late afternoon sun hung low over a quiet stretch of Route 17 just outside a small Midwestern town, casting long golden shadows across cracked pavement and rusted guardrails. Where Emily Carter stood beside a faded blue pickup truck, her hands steady and her expression calm, wiping grease onto a worn cloth tucked into the back pocket of her jeans. While a group of well-dressed travelers gathered near a sleek black luxury sedan parked awkwardly on the shoulder, its hood popped open like a silent admission of failure, the kind of car most people in town only saw in commercials or passing by at 70 miles per hour. And yet here it was, silent, powerless, and surrounded by frustration, as one sharply dressed assistant paced back and forth, phone pressed tightly to his ear, muttering about missed meetings and unacceptable delays, while another man, taller, composed, dressed in a tailored navy suit that caught the sunlight just right, stood a few steps back, watching with narrowed eyes, his presence quiet but commanding, the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to be heard. And yet his patience was wearing thin as the assistant finally snapped the phone shut and glanced toward Emily with visible skepticism, his lips curling slightly as he leaned toward the suited man and whispered something that caused a faint smirk to flicker across his face, because to them, Emily was invisible, just another local woman in work boots and a plain gray shirt, someone who belonged in the background, not someone who could solve their problem. And yet the engine sat there stubbornly silent, ignoring their status, ignoring their urgency, ignoring their money. And when the assistant finally approached her, his tone carried that thin layer of politeness stretched tightly over clear doubt, asking if she knew anything about engines, his eyes already scanning past her as if expecting the real expert to appear any second. But Emily didn't flinch, didn't react, didn't defend herself. She simply looked at the car, then back at him, her voice soft but certain as she said she could take a look. And for a moment, there was hesitation, a pause that hung in the air like a decision balancing on the edge, before the assistant let out a short breath and stepped aside, almost as if allowing it would prove his point. And the suited man, Daniel Brooks, watched it all unfold without saying a word, his gaze sharp, measuring, curious despite himself, as Emily walked toward the car with unhurried steps, the gravel crunching softly beneath her boots, the world around them quieting just enough that even the distant hum of passing trucks felt muted. And as she reached the front of the vehicle, she paused briefly, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the hood, her eyes scanning the engine with a familiarity that didn't need explanation, while behind her, the assistant crossed his arms and muttered under his breath about wasting time, about how this would only make things worse, about how people like her didn't belong near machines like this. And still, Emily said nothing, because she had heard it all before, the assumptions, the dismissals, the quiet judgments that came wrapped in polite smiles, and yet none of it mattered in that moment, because engines didn't care who you were, they responded only to understanding. And as she leaned forward, her hands moving with quiet precision, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough that Daniel's eyes narrowed just slightly, as if for the first time. He wasn't looking at her as a distraction, but as a possibility. And somewhere in the stillness of that roadside moment, the first crack formed in everything they thought they knew, though none of them realized yet that by sunrise, that quiet moment would echo far louder than any of them expected, and that respect, once ignored, was about to arrive in a way no one on that road would ever forget. The engine had been silent for nearly 40 minutes before Emily touched it. And yet within seconds of her lifting the hood fully open, something about the scene began to change, not in a way anyone could easily explain, but in the subtle shift of attention, in the way the assistant stopped pacing and instead washed her hands, in the way even the distant sound of traffic seemed to fade into the background as she leaned in slightly, her fingers tracing along the components with quiet Familiarity, not rushing, not hesitating, just observing, as if the machine itself were speaking to her in a language she understood fluently, while behind her, the assistant exhaled sharply, clearly unimpressed, muttering about how they did not have time for guesswork, how a certified technician was already on the way from the city, how this entire situation was becoming ridiculous. But Emily did not respond. She did not look back. She simply reached into her tool bag and pulled out a small wrench, the metal catching the last light of the afternoon, and with a steady motion, she adjusted a connection near the engine block, her movements precise, almost effortless, as if she had done this 1,000 times before, and maybe she had, though no one there knew that, because no one had asked, and no one had cared enough to look beyond what they saw on the surface, and Daniel Brooks, standing a few feet away, noticed that detail. The absence of hesitation, the absence of doubt, the quiet confidence that did not announce itself but simply existed, and it made him narrow his eyes slightly, as if recalibrating his earlier assumptions, while the assistant scoffed again, louder this time, saying something about how tightening random bolts was not going to fix a 600 horsepower engine, his voice carrying just enough for others nearby to hear, inviting a few faint chuckles from two travelers who had slowed their walk to watch, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild amusement, as though this were some roadside entertainment rather than a moment that would soon reshape everything. And still, Emily remained focused, her attention locked entirely on the task in front of her, her hands moving from one point to another, checking, adjusting, listening, until finally she paused, just for a second, her head tilting slightly, as if confirming something only she could detect. And then without ceremony, she stepped back, wiped her hands on the cloth again, and said softly that they could try starting it now. And for a brief moment, no one moved, the assistant looking at her as if she had just suggested something unreasonable, his expression caught between disbelief and irritation, before he turned to Daniel, waiting for instruction, and Daniel held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then gave a small nod, not out of trust, not yet, but out of curiosity, and the assistant reluctantly slid into the driver's seat, his movements stiff, almost performative, as if preparing to prove her wrong. And when he turned the key, there was a heartbeat of silence, a single suspended moment where expectation hung heavy in the air, and then the engine roared to life, smooth, immediate, undeniable, the deep hum of power returning as if it had never left, and the effect was instant. The assistant froze, his hands still on the ignition, his mouth slightly open, the two onlookers straightening as their amusement vanished, replaced by something closer to surprise. And Daniel's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough that the certainty he carried earlier gave way to something quieter, more thoughtful, as he stepped closer to the car, listening to the steady rhythm of the engine, as if confirming it was real, as if verifying that what had just happened could not be dismissed as coincidence. And when he looked back at Emily, she was already closing her tool bag, her posture relaxed, as though this outcome had never been in doubt. And the assistant climbed out slowly, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by a stiff awkwardness as he glanced between Daniel and Emily, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to reconcile what he had just witnessed with what he had believed only minutes ago. And for a moment, the roadside fell completely quiet, no laughter, no commentary, just the steady sound of the engine running and the faint whisper of wind moving through the dry grass nearby. And in that silence, something shifted again, something deeper this time, because respect, once dismissed, had just made itself impossible to ignore, and even though no one said it out loud, they all felt it, the quiet realization that they had misjudged her, that they had underestimated something they never took the time to understand. And Emily, without waiting for acknowledgement, without asking for validation, simply slung her bag over her shoulder and turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, because for her, the job was done, and whatever came next was not something she needed to chase. It was something that would find her, whether they realized it yet or not. For a man like Daniel Brooks, moments like this did not happen by accident, and yet standing there on the side of that quiet road, listening to the steady, flawless rhythm of an engine that had refused to cooperate just minutes before, he knew something about this situation did not fit into the neat categories he was used to controlling. and as Emily adjusted the strap of her worn tool bag and turned as if to leave, he stepped forward, his voice calm, but carrying enough authority to stop her. Without effort, asking how she knew what to fix, not as a challenge this time, but as a genuine question, the kind that rarely left his lips, and Emily paused, glancing back at him with the same quiet composure she had shown from the beginning, her eyes steady, her answer simple, saying she had seen that kind of problem before, that engines often told you what was wrong if you paid attention long enough. And the assistant shifted uncomfortably nearby, clearly unsettled by the shift in tone, by the fact that the conversation was no longer dismissive but curious, respectful even, something he had not expected and did not quite know how to handle. As Daniel studied her for a moment longer, noticing the details he had ignored before, the way her hands, though marked by years of work, moved with precision rather than strain, the way her posture remained relaxed, unbothered by the attention now focused on her, and it occurred to him that confidence like that was not learned overnight. It was earned, quietly, over time, without applause or recognition, and that realization lingered just long enough to make him reach into his jacket and pull out his wallet, offering her a stack of crisp bills, far more than what the job would reasonably cost, a gesture that in his world solved problems quickly and cleanly. But Emily did not reach for it. She did not even look at the amount. She simply shook her head slightly and said she would take $40, the standard rate she charged for roadside fixes, her voice steady, matter of fact, as if there were no reason for it to be anything else. And for a brief second, Daniel did not respond, not because he was offended, but because he was not used to being refused, especially not in such a calm, unassuming way. And the assistant let out a small, incredulous laugh, muttering that she should take it while she could, that people would line up for an opportunity like this. But Emily only looked at him once, not with anger, not with pride, just with a quiet certainty that made his words fall flat, and then she repeated the amount, not louder, not firmer, just exactly the same, as if the number itself did not need to be defended, and something about that moment shifted the balance once again. Because Daniel slowly lowered the extra cash and instead handed her the exact amount she had asked for, no more, no less. His expression thoughtful, almost measured, as if recalculating something internally, and when she took it, she gave a small nod of thanks, no smile, no lingering conversation, just acknowledgement, before turning fully this time and walking back toward her pickup truck parked a few yards away, her boots crunching softly against the gravel as the sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting the entire scene in a warm, fading light. And no one stopped her, not the assistant, not the onlookers, not even Daniel, who simply stood there watching as she opened the door of her truck and placed her bag inside, moving with the same unhurried rhythm that had defined her from the beginning. And as she drove away, disappearing down the road without looking back, the silence that followed felt different, heavier somehow, not filled with doubt or dismissal, but with something closer to realization, because the problem had been solved, yes, but something else had been revealed in the process, something that could not be measured in dollars or status, something that lingered long after the sound of her engine faded into the distance. And as Daniel finally turned back toward his own car, he did not speak immediately, did not give instructions or check his watch. He simply stood there for a moment longer than usual, his eyes fixed on the empty stretch of road where she had disappeared, as if trying to understand how someone he had dismissed so quickly had just left a lasting impression he could not easily explain. And the assistant, sensing the shift, said nothing this time, because even he could feel it, that quiet, undeniable truth settling into the space between them, that not everything valuable announced itself loudly. And sometimes, the people you overlook are the ones who change everything without even trying. The road stretched empty long after Emily's truck disappeared beyond the bend. But for Daniel Brooks, the moment refused to end as neatly as the engine repair had, because something about that brief encounter lingered in a way he could not dismiss. Not the fix itself, not the money refused, but the quiet certainty she carried, the kind that did not ask for recognition and did not wait for approval. And as he finally stepped back into his car, the soft leather seat and polished interior suddenly felt less impressive than they had an hour ago, as if the meaning of value had shifted slightly without his permission. while his assistant closed the passenger door with more force than necessary. Clearly unsettled, glancing over and attempting to restore normalcy with a forced comment about how fortunate they were that the situation had been resolved quickly, how efficient it had been despite the unexpected detour. But Daniel did not respond immediately, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as he looked ahead at the road, not starting the car right away. And that silence stretched just long enough to make the assistant shift in his seat, unsure whether to continue speaking or remain quiet, until finally Daniel started the engine, the smooth hum now carrying a different weight, a reminder of something he could not quite put into words. And as they merged back onto the highway, the world resumed its usual pace. Cars passing, schedules waiting, obligations calling. But his thoughts did not move as quickly. They stayed behind, somewhere along that quiet roadside where assumptions had quietly unraveled. And miles later, as the skyline of the city began to rise in the distance, glass buildings catching the fading light, Daniel reached for his phone, scrolling briefly before stopping, his thumb hovering over a contact list filled with executives, advisors, and specialists, people he relied on to solve problems with precision and speed. And yet none of those names felt relevant to what had just happened, because what he had witnessed was not just skill. It was something else entirely, something rooted deeper than credentials or reputation. And without saying anything, he locked the phone again and placed it back down, as if acknowledging that this was not a situation that could be handled through the usual channels. While beside him, the assistant finally broke the silence, cautiously suggesting that they still had time to make their meeting, that everything was back on track. His voice carefully measured, trying to regain control of a narrative that had slipped beyond him. But Daniel simply nodded once, his expression composed, though his mind remained elsewhere. And by the time they arrived at their destination, a towering office building surrounded by polished marble and reflective glass, the contrast between that world and the one they had just left felt sharper than ever, as if two entirely different realities had briefly collided and then separated again, leaving behind a question that refused to fade. And inside the building, everything returned to its expected rhythm, assistants greeting him by name, doors opening, conversations resuming with practiced efficiency. But even as Daniel moved through it all, his attention split, part of him present, part of him still replaying the quiet confidence of a woman who had asked for $40 and nothing more. And late into the evening, long after meetings ended and the building emptied, he stood alone in his office, the city lights stretching endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. And for the first time that day, he allowed himself to consider something he rarely entertained. That value was not always where it appeared to be, and that sometimes the most important decisions did not come from strategy or calculation, but from recognizing something others overlooked. And as that thought settled, he turned back toward his desk, his gaze resting briefly on a blank notepad, before reaching for a pen, not to write a plan, not to draft a deal, but to note a single detail he refused to forget. The name of a small roadside mechanic who had quietly shifted the way he saw the world, and somewhere far from the city lights, in a modest neighborhood, where the evening air carried the faint scent of cut grass and distant traffic, Emily Carter finished locking up her garage for the night, unaware that the silence she left behind earlier was still echoing in places she had never seen, and that by morning, the distance between their worlds would not be as wide as it had once seemed. Morning came quietly to Emily Carter's neighborhood, the kind of soft, ordinary morning that carried no hint of the shift already set in motion, as sunlight filtered through the trees lining her street and settled across the modest houses, illuminating peeling paint, neatly trimmed lawns, and the quiet rhythm of people starting their day, while Emily moved through her routine with the same steady pace she always had, unlocking the small garage beside her home, rolling up the metal door with a familiar rattle, and setting her tools out with careful precision, as if nothing had changed, as if the previous day had been no different from any other, because in her world, consistency mattered more than recognition, and work was simply work, not something to be revisited or celebrated. And yet a few houses down, a neighbor paused mid-step, glancing toward the garage with a curious expression, as if expecting something unusual, something that would confirm the quiet story already beginning to spread, because word traveled quickly in a place like this. Not loudly, not dramatically, but through small conversations, brief exchanges, subtle glances, and by the time Emily tightened the last bolt on her first job of the morning, a handful of people had already heard about the luxury car, about the man in the tailored suit, about the way she had fixed something others could not, though none of them knew the full truth, and none of them understood what was coming next. And across town, far removed from the simplicity of that street, Daniel Brooks stood on the rooftop of a high-rise building, the wind brushing lightly against his jacket as he looked out over the city, his expression composed but distant, as if his thoughts had not yet caught up with the new day. While behind him, a pilot ran through final checks on a sleek, dark helicopter, its polished surface reflecting the morning light, the quiet whir of preparation building gradually into a low, steady hum. And the assistant from the day before stood nearby, holding a tablet, his posture rigid, his tone careful as he confirmed schedules, meetings, expectations, everything returning to its familiar structure. But Daniel barely acknowledged it, his attention fixed on something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with contracts or deadlines. And when the assistant hesitated, asking where exactly they were headed first, Daniel answered without turning, his voice calm, certain, giving an address that did not appear anywhere on the day's itinerary, an address tied to a quiet street miles away from the polished edges of the city. And for a brief moment, the assistant froze, caught between questioning and compliance, before nodding and relaying the coordinates to the pilot, who adjusted the route without comment, because orders like this were not unusual for a man like Daniel Brooks, even if their meaning was not immediately clear. And within minutes, the helicopter lifted from the rooftop, rising smoothly into the sky, the city shrinking beneath them as they moved toward a destination that felt out of place in every measurable way. And back on that quiet street, Emily wiped her hands once more, stepping out of the garage to take a short breath, the morning air cool against her skin, when she heard it, faint at first, a distant rhythm that did not belong to passing cars or neighborhood noise, a sound that grew steadily louder, drawing attention one by one as heads turned, conversations paused, and doors opened, until the source revealed itself above them. A helicopter descending slowly, its presence impossible to ignore, casting shifting shadows across the street as it approached an open patch of ground just beyond the row of houses. And the reaction was immediate: confusion, curiosity, disbelief, neighbors stepping outside, pointing upward, trying to make sense of something that did not belong in their world. And Emily stood still for a moment, her expression unchanged, her eyes following the motion without surprise, without urgency, as if she understood something the others did not. And as the helicopter touched down, the wind from its blades stirring dust and loose leaves into the air, the entire street seemed to hold its breath, waiting, watching, as the door slowly opened and a figure stepped out, composed, deliberate, unmistakable. And in that moment, the quiet line between two worlds began to dissolve, not loudly, not forcefully, but with the same quiet certainty that had defined everything from the beginning. Because what arrived that morning was not just a machine or a man. It was the undeniable consequence of a moment no one had taken seriously until it was too late to ignore. The moment Daniel Brooks stepped down from the helicopter, the noise did not fade immediately, but the energy of the street shifted in a way that no one could ignore, because this was not just a visitor, not just a stranger arriving in an unfamiliar place. This was presence, unmistakable and heavy with meaning. And as the rotor blades slowed and the wind settled, the quiet neighborhood seemed to lean inward, every pair of eyes fixed on the man walking forward with calm, deliberate steps, his polished shoes touching ground that had never seen anything like them. While behind him, his assistant followed more cautiously, glancing around at the modest homes and curious faces, clearly out of place, clearly aware that this moment was no longer controlled, no longer predictable. And Emily stood near the entrance of her garage, her posture relaxed, her expression unchanged, as if the arrival unfolding before her was not a surprise, but an expected continuation of something already set in motion. And when Daniel reached her, he did not rush into words. He did not fill the space with explanations or apologies. He simply stopped a few feet away, meeting her gaze with a quiet respect that had not been there the day before. and for a brief second, the entire street fell into silence, the kind that carried weight, the kind that marked the beginning of something important. And then he spoke, his voice even, controlled, but unmistakably sincere, saying that what she had done was not just a repair, it was a solution his own team had failed to provide, that he had spent years surrounded by experts who relied on systems, certifications, and procedures, yet none of them had seen what she had seen in seconds. And Emily listened without interruption, her eyes steady, her hands resting loosely at her sides, not impressed, not intimidated, just present, as if his words were simply information, not validation. And the assistant shifted slightly behind Daniel, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, as if unsure how to reconcile this version of his employer with the one he had known. And Daniel continued, explaining that he had built companies on recognizing value where others did not, on investing in people who could see beyond the obvious, and that yesterday, he had nearly made the mistake of overlooking that. And there was a pause then, not awkward, not uncertain, but intentional, as if he was choosing his next words carefully, because what he was about to say did not belong to his usual world of contracts and negotiations. And when he finally spoke again, he offered her an opportunity, not framed as a favor, not presented as a transaction, but as a recognition, inviting her to work with him, to bring that same clarity, that same instinct, into an environment where it could reshape things far beyond a roadside repair. And the reaction from the small crowd was immediate, though unspoken, a ripple of disbelief, of astonishment, of realization spreading from one neighbor to the next, because this was no longer a quiet story shared in passing. This was something undeniable unfolding in real time. And yet Emily did not respond right away. She did not step forward or step back. She simply looked at him for a moment longer, as if measuring not the offer, but the intention behind it. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained calm, grounded, asking what exactly he expected from her, not out of doubt, but out of clarity. And Daniel answered without hesitation, saying he expected honesty, precision, and the same unwillingness to overcomplicate what should be simple, because that was something his world had forgotten. And again, silence settled, not empty, but full of meaning, as the distance between them closed not physically, but in understanding. And around them, the neighborhood watched, not just witnessing a moment of opportunity, but witnessing a shift in perspective, because the woman they had always known, the one who worked quietly, who asked for little, who kept to herself, was now standing at the center of something far larger than any of them had imagined. And as the wind from the helicopter finally died down completely, leaving the air still and clear, one truth settled into the space between everyone present, that value does not announce itself with noise. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the one who changes everything. Emily did not answer immediately, and that silence carried more weight than any quick acceptance ever could, because in a world where people rushed toward opportunity, her stillness felt almost unfamiliar, as if she were standing outside the urgency that drove everyone else. And Daniel noticed that. He noticed the way she did not react to the helicopter, did not glance at the growing crowd, did not let the presence of wealth or status change the rhythm of her breathing. And for the first time in a long time, he found himself waiting, not directing, not influencing, simply waiting for someone else to decide. While around them, the neighbors shifted slightly, their earlier curiosity now transforming into something deeper, something closer to awe, because what they were witnessing was no longer just about a job offer. It was about a quiet recalibration of worth. And Emily finally spoke, her voice calm, grounded, asking him why he had come back personally, why he had not sent someone else, someone more aligned with his world. And the question hung in the air, simple on the surface, but precise enough to cut through everything else. And Daniel held her gaze, answering without hesitation, saying that some decisions could not be delegated, that recognizing something rare required presence, not distance, and that yesterday, he had almost missed it, and he was not willing to make that mistake twice. And there was a shift then, subtle but undeniable, as if the truth in his words settled into the space between them, not as persuasion, but as acknowledgement. And Emily looked down briefly, not in uncertainty, but in thought, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of her tool bag. the same bag she had carried for years, the same one that held everything she needed to solve problems others could not. And for a moment, the weight of two paths stood quietly before her, one familiar, predictable, rooted in routine and independence, the other uncertain, expansive, filled with possibilities that did not come with guarantees. And yet what defined her was not fear of change, it was clarity of purpose. And when she looked back up, her expression had not changed, but something in her eyes had settled, something firm, something decided. And she told him that she did not need a title, did not need a position that sounded impressive, that if she were to accept anything, it would be on her terms, that she would solve problems, not sit in meetings, that she would work when something needed to be understood, not when a schedule demanded it, and that she would remain exactly who she was, not someone reshaped to fit into his world. And the assistant shifted sharply at that, clearly unprepared for someone to set conditions so directly, especially in front of an offer like this. But Daniel did not interrupt, did not push back, because what she was describing was exactly what he had been searching for, even if he had never heard it put so simply and slowly, almost imperceptibly. He nodded, not as a concession, but as agreement, because he understood something in that moment that many in his position never did. That real value could not be molded. It had to be respected as it was, and the tension in the air eased, not dramatically, but enough that the silence no longer felt uncertain. It felt resolved. And around them, the neighbors exchanged glances, their earlier assumptions dissolving completely now, replaced by a quiet pride, because the woman they had always seen as ordinary had just defined the terms of something extraordinary without raising her voice, without changing her tone, without becoming anything other than herself. And as the helicopter waited behind them, no longer an intrusion but a symbol of what had already shifted, Emily gave a small nod, not as acceptance of the world he represented, but as acknowledgement of the understanding they had reached. And Daniel extended his hand, not as a formality, but as a gesture of equal ground. And when she shook it, the moment carried no spectacle, no dramatic flourish, just a quiet certainty that something real had begun. And in that stillness, as the wind settled and the street returned to its natural rhythm, one truth stood clearer than ever, that respect is not given when power arrives. It is earned when someone refuses to change who they are in order to receive it. The handshake ended without ceremony, but its meaning lingered long after their hands separated, settling into the quiet air of the neighborhood like something permanent, something that could not be undone. And for a moment, no one spoke, not Daniel, not his assistant, not even the neighbors who had gathered along the edges of the street, because they all understood, in their own way, that they had just witnessed something rare, something that did not need explanation to be felt. And Emily stepped back slightly, her attention already shifting away from the spectacle and back toward the open garage behind her, where tools remained laid out with the same careful order, where work still waited, because for her, nothing about this moment changed what mattered most. And Daniel noticed that immediately, the way she did not linger in the significance of what had just happened, the way she returned her focus to what was real and present. And it reinforced everything he had come to understand about her in such a short time, that her value was not tied to opportunity, but to consistency. And as the assistant cleared his throat quietly, stepping forward with a tablet in hand, ready to formalize what had just been agreed upon, Daniel raised a hand slightly, stopping him without looking, because he knew this was not something that would be captured in contracts or outlined in bullet points. Not yet, not like this. And instead, he turned back to Emily, asking when she would be ready to begin, his tone steady, respectful, as if acknowledging that the answer belonged entirely to her. And Emily considered the question briefly, her eyes moving across the familiar space of her garage, the worn floor, the shelves lined with tools, the quiet evidence of years spent building something steady and honest. And she answered simply that she would finish what she had already committed to first, that she did not leave work undone, no matter what came next. And Daniel nodded again, understanding without needing further explanation, because that answer alone told him more about her than any resume ever could. And behind him, the assistant lowered the tablet slightly, the urgency gone from his posture, replaced by something closer to observation, as if he too was beginning to see what his employer had recognized. and the neighbors began to disperse slowly, conversations forming in low voices. Glances exchanged with a mixture of surprise and quiet admiration, because the story they would carry from this moment was not just about the helicopter or the man who arrived in it. It was about the woman who stood unchanged in its presence. And as Daniel turned to leave, walking back toward the helicopter with measured steps, he paused once more, looking back over his shoulder, not to confirm anything, but as if acknowledging the distance he had crossed, not in miles, but in understanding. And Emily had already returned to her work, tightening a bolt on the engine in front of her, her movements steady, unaffected, as if nothing extraordinary had just taken place. And the simplicity of that image stayed with him as he climbed back into the helicopter, the door closing softly behind him, sealing the moment without diminishing it. And as the rotor blades began to turn again, lifting the machine slowly into the sky, the neighborhood watched until it became a distant shape against the horizon, and then even that disappeared, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before, fuller, more aware, as if something had been revealed that could not be unseen. And inside the helicopter, Daniel sat quietly, his gaze directed outward, but his thoughts anchored firmly to the ground he had just left, because he knew that what had begun there would not follow the usual path of business or expectation. It would unfold in its own way, shaped by the same quiet certainty that had defined her from the beginning. And miles below, Emily continued her work without pause, the steady rhythm of her tools echoing softly in the garage, grounded, consistent, unchanged. And in that quiet continuation, there was a truth more powerful than anything that had arrived in the sky, that real value does not chase recognition. And when it is finally seen, it does not need to prove itself. It simply continues, exactly as it always has. In the days that followed, nothing about Emily Carter's routine appeared different to anyone passing by, and yet everything about how she was seen had quietly changed, because the same garage still opened each morning with the same metallic rattle. The same tools were laid out with the same careful precision, and the same steady rhythm of work filled the air. But now, there was something else present. Something unspoken that lingered in the glances of those who walked by, in the way neighbors paused a little longer than before, in the subtle shift from familiarity to recognition, not of what she had become, but of what she had always been. And across the city, Daniel Brooks carried that same awareness into a world that had once felt completely defined, because in meetings filled with confident voices and polished presentations, he found himself noticing what was missing: the simplicity, the clarity, the instinct that did not rely on layers of explanation. And more than once, he paused mid-conversation, letting silence settle just long enough to remind those around him that not every answer needed to be complicated. And though no one said it directly, the shift was felt, the quiet recalibration of what he valued, what he trusted, what he was willing to wait for. And when he returned to Emily's street days later, there was no helicopter this time, no announcement, no spectacle, just a car pulling quietly to the side of the road, and a man stepping out who no longer needed to prove anything by arriving loudly, because the message had already been delivered. And inside the garage, Emily worked as she always had, finishing a repair before stepping back, wiping her hands, and looking up as he approached, her expression unchanged, her presence steady. And their conversation was simple, direct, without unnecessary words, because what needed to be understood had already been said. And from that point forward, their connection unfolded not through grand gestures or public moments, but through a series of quiet decisions, problems brought to her not with expectations, but with respect, solutions returned not with explanation, but with results. And over time, those who worked closest to Daniel began to notice a pattern, that when something truly mattered, when clarity was needed above all else, he would step away from the noise, away from the layers of complexity, and return to a place where answers were found not in titles or credentials, but in understanding. And Emily never changed the way she worked, never adjusted her pace to match the urgency of others, never allowed the attention to reshape her into something she was not, because what made her valuable was never something that needed to be improved, only something that needed to be seen. And in the quiet space between their worlds, a balance formed, one built not on hierarchy, but on recognition, not on control, but on trust. And back on that same stretch of road where everything had begun, cars still passed by at 70 miles per hour, unaware of the moment that had unfolded there, unaware of the shift that had taken place, because the most important changes rarely announce themselves to everyone. They settle quietly into the lives of those who are ready to see them, and for those who had witnessed it. For those who had once looked at Emily and seen only what was on the surface, the memory remained, not as a story of surprise, but as a lesson that stayed with them long after the details faded, that the world does not always reveal its truths through noise or display, and that sometimes the person you overlook is the one who understands everything you have missed. And on a quiet evening, as the sun dipped low and the garage door closed once more, Emily stood for a moment in the stillness, not reflecting on what had changed, but simply existing within it, because for her, nothing needed to be proven, nothing needed to be claimed, and in that quiet certainty, the world, in its own way, had already adjusted around her, and that day, without headlines or applause, something far more lasting had taken place, the quiet recognition of what dignity looks like when it does not ask to be seen.